On the surface, the Sinclair family seemed perfect. Ethan, a successful software engineer, and Vivian, a talented interior designer, were living the American dream in their picturesque home in Santa Barbara, California. But beneath the polished exterior of their lives, something darker was beginning to stir. Ethan Sinclair sat in his home office late one evening, staring at his computer screen. He was supposed to be finishing a project, but his mind had wandered. Lately, it often did. Life felt predictable, even dull. A successful career, a loving wife, a beautiful home, things most people would kill for, but Ethan felt an emptiness he couldn't quite explain. At dinner that evening, the silence between Ethan and Vivian was deafening. Vivian smiled and chatted about her latest interior design project, but Ethan was distracted. His thoughts kept circling back to the feeling that something was missing. Vivian noticed his lack of enthusiasm and asked, "Is everything okay? You've seemed distant lately." Ethan brushed it off. "Work's just been stressful," he said, forcing a smile. Vivian nodded, but deep down, she knew there was more to it. She just didn't know what. One night, unable to sleep, Ethan found himself browsing online forums. What began as idle scrolling soon turned into something more deliberate. A thread about rekindling passion in long-term relationships caught his eye. It was filled with couples discussing unconventional ways they had reignited their relationships. One particular topic stood out: cuckolding. At first, Ethan was shocked by the idea, but the more he read, the more intrigued he became. It wasn't just about the act, it was about the thrill, the mix of control and vulnerability. The concept ignited something in him, something he hadn't felt in years. But it also terrified him. The next morning, Ethan was quieter than usual. Vivian, as perceptive as ever, asked if he wanted to talk. He shook his head. "It's nothing," he lied. But the truth was, the idea he had stumbled upon the night before wouldn't leave his mind. Weeks passed, and Ethan couldn't shake his fascination. Late nights became routine, with Ethan pretending to work while delving deeper into the online world he had discovered. Vivian noticed his growing distance, but she wasn't sure how to address it. She felt him slipping away and began to wonder if their marriage was starting to crack. One evening, over a bottle of wine, Vivian finally confronted him. "Ethan," she said gently, "you've been so withdrawn. Please, just talk to me. Whatever it is, I want to understand." Ethan hesitated. His heart raced as he considered what he was about to say. Finally, he took a deep breath. "Vivian, I've been thinking about something different. Something that might bring us closer." Her eyebrows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Ethan explained, haltingly at first, about what he had discovered online. He spoke about the concept of cuckolding, not in detail, but enough for Vivian to understand. He braced himself for anger, disgust, or rejection. But to his surprise, Vivian didn't react the way he feared. She was shocked, yes, but she didn't immediately shut him down. Instead, she asked questions, trying to understand. "Why do you think this appeals to you?" she asked, her tone thoughtful rather than accusatory. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "I think it's about trust, and maybe finding something new to break the monotony." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. "This is unexpected," she finally said. "But I won't dismiss it outright. Let me think about it." That night, as Vivian lay awake beside Ethan, her mind raced. She couldn't deny the cracks in their marriage. Though she loved Ethan, she, too, had felt the weight of routine settling in. The idea he had proposed was shocking, but it also stirred a part of her that she hadn't acknowledged in years, a part that craved excitement, attention, and something new. Ethan, lying awake beside her, felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He had taken a leap of faith, but he wasn't sure if it would save their marriage or destroy it. The perfect Sinclair family had always been the envy of their friends and neighbors. But behind the manicured lawn and the white picket fence, a storm was brewing, one that would shatter their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. This chapter of the Sinclair story sets the stage for what's to come. Ethan's confession has opened a door that can't be closed. Vivian's curiosity and Ethan's desperation will lead them down a path filled with excitement, danger, and irreversible consequences. What happens when boundaries are crossed, and trust is tested beyond its limits? Stay tuned for the next chapter of this gripping story. Sometimes, the most dangerous paths are the ones we open with good intentions. For Ethan and Vivian Sinclair, what began as a spark to reignite their marriage would soon become a fire they could no longer control. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Vivian's reaction to his confession. She hadn't rejected him outright, and that alone felt like a victory. Over the following weeks, he tried to bring up the subject carefully, gauging her mood and her thoughts. To his relief, she didn't avoid the conversation. In fact, she seemed curious, tentative, but curious. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Vivian finally broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice measured. Ethan turned to her, his pulse quickening. "It's unconventional," she continued, "but maybe it's worth exploring. If it means we can connect in a deeper way, I think we owe it to ourselves to try." Ethan felt a surge of relief and excitement, though it was tempered by an underlying unease. He nodded, doing his best to hide the tension in his voice. "We don't have to rush into anything," he reassured her. "It's just about being open and honest. We'll set boundaries." Vivian gave a small, uncertain smile. "Okay," she said. "Let's take it slow." In the days that followed, Ethan and Vivian talked more than they had in months. They discussed their boundaries, their expectations, and their fears. At first, it felt liberating, a shared secret that brought them closer. But as they delved deeper, Vivian began to notice a change in Ethan. He seemed more alive, more engaged, but also different. There was a hunger in him that hadn't been there before, and it made her uneasy. Vivian decided to distract herself with work, diving into a new project for a high-profile client. It was during a charity art auction in Los Angeles, while mingling with potential collaborators, that she met Julian Westbrook. Julian was magnetic. With his tailored suit, sharp wit, and warm smile, he had an effortless charm that drew people in. As the owner of a prestigious art gallery, he moved through the room with ease, commanding attention without seeming to try. When Vivian introduced herself, Julian's eyes lit up with genuine interest. They spent the evening in animated conversation, discussing art, design, and their shared appreciation for creativity. When Vivian returned home that night, she told Ethan about the auction, and about Julian. "He's incredibly charismatic," she said, her voice carrying a note of excitement. "We might even collaborate on a project together." Ethan listened intently, his mind racing. The name Julian Westbrook stuck in his head. He didn't say it out loud, but he couldn't help wondering, could this Julian be the answer to their experiment? A week later, Ethan brought it up. "So, this Julian guy," he began casually, "he seems interesting. Do you think he'd be open-minded enough to help us explore this idea?" Vivian blinked in surprise. "Julian? I don't know. I mean, we've only just met." Ethan leaned forward, his tone gentle but insistent. "You said he was charming, sophisticated. Maybe he's the right person to make this work, for both of us. You trust him, right?" Vivian hesitated. The idea of involving Julian felt strange, even dangerous. But the way Ethan framed it, as if it were a joint decision, made her feel oddly reassured. "I'd have to get to know him better," she said finally. "But I guess, maybe." Over the next few weeks, Vivian and Julian met several times under the guise of professional collaboration. Each meeting felt more natural than the last, and Vivian found herself looking forward to their conversations. Julian was attentive, witty, and respectful. But there was also something more, a spark she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder what it would be like to be desired so openly, so freely. Ethan, meanwhile, couldn't hide his growing excitement. Every time Vivian returned from a meeting with Julian, he would eagerly ask about the details. What did you talk about? How did he act? Did he seem interested? His curiosity bordered on obsession, but Vivian chalked it up to his desire to make their experiment work. Finally, after a particularly engaging meeting with Julian, Vivian decided to take the next step. Over coffee, she broached the subject delicately. To her surprise, Julian wasn't shocked. In fact, he admitted he'd encountered similar arrangements before in his social circles. It's unconventional, he said, his voice smooth and calm, but I can see the appeal. If you're both comfortable, I'd be open to exploring it with you. That evening, Vivian shared Julian's response with Ethan. The excitement in his eyes was undeniable. This is it, he said, gripping her hand. We're finally moving forward. But as they began planning their first encounter with Julian, a new tension crept into their conversations. Vivian felt it every time Ethan asked for details, every time his questions seemed to linger too long on how Julian had made her feel. For all his enthusiasm, there was an edge to his tone, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. For Ethan, that edge was jealousy. He didn't expect it, but it was there, gnawing at him every time Vivian mentioned Julian. He told himself it was part of the process, that he would adjust. But deep down, he couldn't shake the fear that he was losing something he couldn't afford to lose. Vivian, too, felt conflicted. She wanted to trust Ethan's intentions, to believe that this was about strengthening their bond. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that they were opening a door they might never be able to close. Ethan and Vivian Sinclair had taken their first step into a world they didn't fully understand. What began as a way to rekindle their marriage now carried the weight of anticipation, doubt, and a growing sense of danger. The perfect facade of the Sinclair family was starting to crack, and the darkness seeping through was only just beginning. The decision had been made. Ethan and Vivian Sinclair opened a door they couldn't close, inviting Julian Westbrook into their lives. What they didn't know was that some invitations come with consequences far beyond imagination. It was a cool summer evening in Los Angeles when Julian Westbrook arrived at the Sinclair home for the first time. The soft hum of his black luxury car in the driveway was the only sound on the quiet suburban street. Vivian had prepared everything meticulously. Candles flickered on the dining table, a bottle of wine was chilling, and she wore a sleek black dress that Ethan hadn't seen her wear in years. Ethan paced in the living room, his excitement tinged with nervousness. When the doorbell rang, Vivian opened it with a radiant smile. Julian stepped in, carrying a bouquet of lilies for her and a bottle of whiskey for Ethan. I thought it would be a good icebreaker, Julian said, his warm tone immediately putting both of them at ease. The evening began with laughter and casual conversation. Julian shared stories from his life in the art world, his wit and charm captivating both Ethan and Vivian. But beneath the surface, there was a tension that neither Ethan nor Vivian could quite name, a charged undercurrent that would only grow stronger as the night went on. As the night progressed, the alcohol loosened their nerves, and the conversation turned more intimate. Julian leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze fixed on Vivian. You're a fascinating woman, he said, his voice smooth. Ethan's a lucky man. Vivian blushed, and Ethan, though smiling, felt a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar, jealousy. Finally, Julian set down his glass and looked at them both. So, he said, a playful edge in his voice, how do we want to proceed? The room grew quiet. Vivian glanced at Ethan, who nodded subtly. She stood, took Julian's hand, and led him upstairs, leaving Ethan alone in the dimly lit living room. As he poured himself another glass of whiskey, Ethan's heart raced. This was what he had wanted, what he had asked for. But now that it was happening, it felt overwhelming. From the armchair, Ethan could hear the faint sounds from the bedroom above. His fantasy was playing out in real life, yet it wasn't as simple as he had imagined. Alongside the excitement, there was a gnawing sense of unease. A part of him couldn't ignore how natural Vivian seemed with Julian, how easily she slipped into this new role. When they finally returned downstairs, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Julian smiled warmly, thanked them for the evening, and left. Vivian sat beside Ethan, her expression a mix of exhilaration and apprehension. "How do you feel?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated. I think it went well," he said, forcing a smile. But deep down, he wasn't sure. After that night, Ethan and Vivian's arrangement with Julian became a regular occurrence. At first, it seemed manageable. They set clear rules, and Ethan felt like he was still in control. But as weeks turned into months, those boundaries began to blur. Vivian started dressing differently, bolder, more vibrant, and Ethan couldn't help but notice the way her eyes lit up whenever Julian was around. Their encounters became less structured, more spontaneous. Julian stayed longer, joining them for dinner or spending weekends at their home. What had started as a controlled experiment now felt like an uncharted territory. Ethan tried to ignore the growing discomfort, but the signs were impossible to miss. One evening, he came home early from work and found Vivian on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. When she saw him, she quickly ended the call. "Just a client," she said, smiling, but the way she avoided his gaze told a different story. In their private moments, Vivian seemed distant. She was still enthusiastic during their encounters with Julian, but when it was just the two of them, she often seemed preoccupied. Ethan tried to reignite their connection, surprising her with date nights, attempting intimate conversations, but it wasn't the same. The more he tried, the more he felt like he was losing her. One evening, after another late-night encounter with Julian, Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. "Do you still want this?" he asked Vivian, his voice heavy with frustration. "Because it feels like I'm losing you." Vivian looked at him, her expression a mix of guilt and defiance. "You're the one who wanted this, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "And now that it's happening, you can't handle it." "That's not what this was supposed to be," Ethan shot back. "You're supposed to be with me, not him." Her eyes narrowed. "Maybe you should have thought about that before dragging us into this." The argument ended with Vivian storming out of the room, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. That night, as he sat in the darkened living room, Ethan's mind spiraled. His feelings of jealousy and inadequacy grew stronger with each passing moment. For the first time, he began to see Julian not as a collaborator, but as a threat. It was during a weekend dinner when Ethan noticed something that pushed him over the edge. As Julian told a story about a recent art exhibit, Vivian leaned in, laughing and touching his arm. It was a small gesture, but to Ethan, it felt like a betrayal. That night, as he lay awake beside Vivian, a dangerous thought crept into his mind: this has to stop. Julian can't stay in our lives. I have to fix this before it's too late. Unbeknownst to him, this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would shatter everything. Ethan and Vivian had stepped into a world they didn't fully understand. What began as an attempt to save their marriage was now tearing it apart. And as jealousy and obsession took hold, Ethan was about to make a choice that would change their lives forever. What happens when you lose control of the world you've built? For Ethan Sinclair, what began as a thrilling experiment in trust had spiraled into a waking nightmare. And for Vivian, the lines between excitement and betrayal had begun to blur. Ethan sat in his car parked outside their Santa Barbara home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded as he scrolled through Vivian's messages on her unlocked phone, a habit he'd started weeks ago. Most were harmless, but tonight, there it was, a text from Julian Westbrook. "Looking forward to seeing you again. Last night was unforgettable." Ethan's breath hitched. The words swirled in his mind like a storm. It wasn't the first time he had suspected something deeper between Vivian and Julian, but this felt different. More real. More damning. When Vivian walked through the front door an hour later, Ethan was waiting for her. "You're late," he said, his voice colder than he intended. Vivian sighed, setting her purse down. "I told you I had a client meeting." "With Julian?" Ethan pressed, his tone sharp. Vivian froze, her eyes narrowing. "You don't trust me, do you?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I trusted us. I trusted this arrangement. But I feel like I'm losing you, Vivian." "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "This was your idea, Ethan. You pushed for this. Now you're blaming me because you can't handle it." The argument escalated quickly, the words cutting deeper with each exchange. For the first time, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. He had opened the door to this world, but now, it felt like Vivian and Julian were the ones in control. Over the next few weeks, Ethan noticed more changes in Vivian. She started dressing differently, bold colors, elegant cuts, a style that seemed to radiate confidence. She smiled more, but not at him. And when they were alone, her mind always seemed elsewhere. One evening, Ethan decided to come home early, hoping to surprise Vivian. He found her in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones on the phone. When he walked in, she quickly hung up. "Who was that?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. "Just a client," Vivian replied, not meeting his eyes. Ethan's stomach churned. He didn't believe her, but he didn't press further. Instead, he spent the night spiraling, imagining every possible scenario of what she could have been saying, and to whom. Vivian's interactions with Julian became more frequent. What had started as structured encounters with Ethan's involvement now seemed to have a life of its own. She began meeting Julian alone, ostensibly for work. Ethan tried to convince himself that everything was fine, but the knot in his stomach tightened with each passing day. One night, Ethan confronted Vivian again. "Why does it feel like he's more important to you than I am?" Vivian turned to him, her expression a mix of guilt and frustration. "That's not true," she said. "But you wanted this, Ethan. You asked for it. And now that it's happening, you're acting like I'm the one who's done something wrong." "Maybe I didn't realize what I was asking for," Ethan shot back. "Maybe I didn't expect you to fall for him." Her eyes widened. "You think I'm in love with him? Aren't you?" Ethan demanded. Vivian hesitated, and in that pause, Ethan felt his heart break. "I love you," she said finally, her voice soft. "But Julian, he makes me feel alive." The admission cut deeper than anything Ethan could have imagined. That night, as Vivian slept beside him, Ethan lay awake, consumed by thoughts of Julian. He had to do something. He had to take back control. A few days later, Ethan found himself parked outside Julian's art gallery in Los Angeles. He watched as Julian stepped out, smiling and chatting with a client. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. For weeks, he had felt helpless, but now, watching Julian move so effortlessly through his life, Ethan's helplessness turned into something darker, rage. Later that evening, at dinner, Julian joined the Sinclairs for what was supposed to be another casual meeting. But this time, the tension in the air was palpable. Ethan watched as Vivian laughed at Julian's jokes, her hand brushing his arm. It was a small gesture, but to Ethan, it felt like a dagger. After Julian left, Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. "You're in love with him, aren't you?" he asked, his voice trembling with anger. Vivian stared at him, her expression a mix of defiance and sadness. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I can't keep pretending that everything is fine between us." Ethan's world crumbled. That night, he sat alone in the living room, the weight of their crumbling marriage pressing down on him like a vice. His mind raced with thoughts of Julian, of the life he had invaded, the marriage he had disrupted. This has to end, Ethan thought. One way or another, it has to end. Ethan and Vivian's carefully constructed world was unraveling, and the tension between them had reached a breaking point. For Ethan, jealousy and despair had turned into a dangerous obsession. For Vivian, the lines between love and betrayal had blurred beyond recognition. And for Julian, the consequences of his charm and involvement were closer than he realized. They say jealousy is a green-eyed monster, but for Ethan Sinclair, jealousy had transformed into something far more dangerous, a force that would drive him to the edge of his sanity, and beyond. It was a humid August evening in Los Angeles when Ethan Sinclair made the decision that would change everything. He had been drinking since the afternoon, replaying the events of the past few weeks in his mind. Vivian's laughter with Julian, her lingering glances, the text messages she tried to hide, it all felt like a betrayal he could no longer endure. By the time the sun set, Ethan was no longer just angry. He was resolved. Ethan grabbed his car keys and the wrench he kept in the garage for repairs. Wrapping it in a towel, he stuffed it into a gym bag and left the house without saying a word to Vivian. His hands trembled as he drove, the distant glow of the Los Angeles skyline coming into view. His destination, Julian Westbrook's art gallery. Julian's gallery was closed for the night, but Ethan knew he would be there. He had watched him enough to know his routine, how Julian often stayed late, preparing for upcoming exhibits or enjoying a quiet moment after the day's bustle. Ethan parked a block away and walked toward the gallery, the weight of the gym bag pulling heavily at his side. The street was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of traffic in the distance. As he approached the building, he saw Julian inside, alone, tidying up. The sight of him, calm, composed, and seemingly unbothered, ignited a fresh wave of anger in Ethan. Ethan waited until Julian stepped out to lock the door. As Julian turned, he froze, surprised to see Ethan standing there. "Ethan," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "This is unexpected. Is everything okay?" Ethan stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "No, Julian," he said, his voice low and trembling with rage. "Nothing is okay." Julian's expression shifted, the calm facade slipping slightly. "Look, if this is about Vivian." "Of course it's about Vivian." Ethan exploded. "You've been tearing apart my marriage, my life, and you don't even care, do you?" Julian raised his hands defensively. "Ethan, I'm not trying to take her away from you. This was your arrangement. I just went along with what you both wanted." Ethan took another step forward, his voice now shaking with emotion. "She was my wife. My life. And now I'm nothing to her. Nothing, because of you." Julian's tone softened. "Ethan, listen to me. If this has gotten out of hand, we can fix it. I'll step back. But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. The months of frustration, jealousy, and despair erupted in a single, uncontrollable motion. He swung the gym bag, the wrench inside slamming against Julian's shoulder and sending him stumbling back against the gallery door. "Ethan, stop!" Julian shouted, his voice tinged with panic. But Ethan's vision was red, his mind consumed by the weight of every betrayal he had imagined. He pulled the wrench from the bag and lunged. The first strike sent Julian to the ground, blood splattering across the pavement. The second strike silenced his protests. By the third, the only sound was Ethan's labored breathing and the distant rumble of traffic. Ethan stood over Julian's lifeless body, the wrench slick with blood in his trembling hand. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, horrifying clarity. He had done it. He had killed a man. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen, staring at Julian's body. Then, panic set in. He dragged Julian into the alley behind the gallery, hiding the body behind a dumpster. He wiped down the door handle and any surfaces he thought he might have touched, his movements frantic and clumsy. When he was satisfied, or as close to it as he could be, Ethan stumbled back to his car. The wrench, still stained with blood, was shoved back into the gym bag. His hands shook as he drove home, his mind racing. What have I done? He thought. What have I become? By the time Ethan pulled into his driveway, a light rain had begun to fall. The droplets washed the blood from his hands but did nothing to cleanse the guilt that now weighed on him like a boulder. He stepped into the house, his body trembling. Vivian was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She glanced up when she heard the door. "You're home late," she said, her tone neutral. Ethan forced a smile. "Yeah, just needed some air." Vivian didn't press further, and Ethan disappeared into the bathroom, locking the door behind him. He turned on the shower and stood under the water, scrubbing his hands until they were raw. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't wash away the image of Julian's broken body. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed the events over and over, each detail searing itself into his memory. Julian's voice, his pleas, the sickening sound of the wrench connecting, it was all too vivid. Vivian slept soundly beside him, unaware of the storm raging inside her husband. But deep down, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. Julian's absence would raise questions, and those questions would eventually lead to answers. For now, though, Ethan had to act normal. He had to pretend that everything was fine. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Ethan's jealousy and desperation had led him to commit the unthinkable. But what he didn't yet realize was that the fallout from his actions would be even more devastating than the crime itself. They say you can bury the past, but the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface. For Ethan Sinclair, the weight of his actions was more than he could bear, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The rain had stopped by the time the sun rose over Santa Barbara, but inside the Sinclair home, a storm still raged. Ethan had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Julian's lifeless body sprawled in the alley. The sound of the wrench connecting with bone echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the man he had become. Vivian, unaware of what had transpired, noticed Ethan's distant demeanor. "Are you okay?" she asked over breakfast. Ethan looked up from his untouched plate, forcing a weak smile. "Yeah. Just tired," he lied. Vivian frowned but didn't press further. She was used to Ethan's mood swings lately, chalking them up to the strain their arrangement had put on him. But deep down, she sensed something had shifted, something she couldn't yet explain. 2 days later, the news broke. Julian Westbrook, a prominent art dealer and fixture in Los Angeles's cultural scene, had been found dead behind his gallery. The police were treating it as a homicide. Ethan was at work when he overheard the breaking news on a colleague's phone. His heart sank, and his hands began to shake so badly he had to excuse himself to the restroom. Locking the door behind him, he splashed cold water on his face, staring at his reflection in the mirror. "They'll find me," he thought. "It's only a matter of time." That evening, Vivian sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, tears welling up as she read about Julian's death. "I can't believe he's gone," she said softly. "He didn't deserve this." Ethan, seated across from her, clenched his jaw. "No, he didn't," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Vivian looked up, noticing the tension in Ethan's face. "You were never really comfortable with Julian, were you?" she asked cautiously. Ethan met her gaze but said nothing. The silence was louder than words. As the days passed, Vivian began to notice inconsistencies in Ethan's behavior. He was more withdrawn than ever, often lost in thought. He avoided conversations about Julian, brushing off her attempts to process their shared grief. Then, one night, while cleaning out the garage, Vivian found a gym bag shoved behind a pile of old boxes. Curious, she opened it, and froze. Inside was a wrench, still stained with what looked like dried blood. Her heart raced as she put the pieces together. The tension, the late-night drives, Ethan's sudden change in behavior, it all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. She confronted him that evening, her voice trembling. "Ethan, what did you do?" Ethan tried to deny it, but the cracks in his facade were too large to hide. Eventually, the weight of his guilt broke him. "I did it," he admitted, his voice a whisper. "I killed him." Vivian's breath hitched as tears streamed down her face. "Why, Ethan? Why would you do this?" "Because I was losing you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. I thought if he was gone, we could fix this. But now, I've ruined everything." The next morning, Vivian called the police. It was the hardest decision she had ever made, but she knew it was the right one. Ethan didn't resist when they arrived to arrest him. As he was led out of the house in handcuffs, he glanced back at Vivian, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted us to be okay." Vivian couldn't respond. She watched as the man she once loved was taken away, leaving her alone in the home they had built together. Ethan's trial was swift but publicized, the story of a love triangle turned deadly, captivating the media. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. In the courtroom, Vivian sat quietly, tears in her eyes as the judge read the verdict. After the trial, Vivian sold the house. She couldn't bear to live among the memories anymore. Moving to a smaller apartment in a quieter town, she tried to rebuild her life. But the shadow of what had happened lingered, a constant reminder of how far things had spiraled out of control. Vivian gave one final interview months later, reflecting on the events. "We thought we were fixing our marriage," she said. "But what we did was break everything beyond repair." The story of Ethan and Vivian Sinclair is not just about jealousy or betrayal. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing boundaries without understanding the consequences. It's a reminder that even the strongest relationships can crumble when trust is replaced by obsession, and love turns into control. What do you think about Ethan's decision? Was he a man driven by love, or by his own insecurities? And what about Vivian? Do you feel she was equally at fault, or just caught in a web of circumstances beyond her control? This story challenges us to reflect on the choices we make in our relationships and how far we're willing to go for the ones we love. We'd love to hear your thoughts, share them in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales that make you think.